Hi there. This is edition 33 of Joy Sightings, and today I read chapter 9, entitled The Orphan Exodus, from Tales of the Resistance by David and Karen Maines. The Orphan Exodus. The Dagoda, a palace of brooding towers and iron gates, of council chambers to devise unjust deeds, and of courtrooms to condemn the innocent, of fire priests' cells and the Secret Service garrison, of prison and torture chambers, of the orphan pavilion where frightened orphans are drilled under the cruel hand of the orphan keeper. From this evil center the enchanter casts his dark spells. The king and big operator approached the Dagoda. Burners guarded all the entrances, their pokers glowing luridly in the dark, while squads of breakers boot-stomped in and out, cudgels held attack ready. Both men knew it was a dangerous night. The king whispered, "The enchanter is readying his forces for assault. Our time is very short." Big operator nodded. They must do what they had come to do quickly, lest their bold plan be aborted. For days, the drivers and dispatchers had watched the king and the chief, huddled together behind the glassed-in office of the city taxi company. Another rescue strategy was in the making. All sensed the bond of love between the two as they concentrated on unfolded maps on the desk. But none knew the plan they were devising was so desperate it could well be big operator's last. Shortly, vanguard orders for an orphan exodus appeared at the dispatcher control panel. The next night, the fleet of swift taxis crept with dimmed headlights through the streets, disconnected from the power source, and took to back alleys. They were to surround the enchanter's Dagoda, await the signal, and then whisk as many escapees from the orphan pavilion as possible to the edge of the garbage dump, where the king himself would accompany the children to Great Park. The orphan pavilion was on one side of the Dagoda, enclosed by a high wall with a surrounding courtyard. A sign beside the tall gate proclaimed, "We love children, Orphan Keepers Association." But everyone in Enchanted City knew that children were loved only because they provided forced labor to do the dirty work of the enchanter. Two huge wolves the size of lions guarded either side of the entrance. They growled as the men approached. They bared their teeth and drooled. A soft light gathered around the king. The wolves stared, whimpered, and then hid their heads in their paws while the two men passed them by. All closed places opened to the king when he so willed it. Inside, a squad of orphans wearing tattered rags scrubbed the courtyard. A keeper's assistant with a whistle around her neck chanted, "Clean, clean, clean," and stood ready to beat the slow workers with a long stick. Another work detail, a long line of children tied together at the ankles with rough sections of rope, were getting ready to collect the city garbage which citizens tossed on the street. A whistle blew. "Wheat! Wheat!" The crew marched to the waiting carts, while another assistant prodded them with the sharp tines of her forked shovel. Huge vats of water boiled while children stirred the dirty clothes within. The hot water splashed on the orphans, burning them one moment and then soaking them to the skin in the cold night. An assistant prodded them with a long wooden turning spoon. "Wheat!" She blew her whistle and shouted, "Scoundrels! Dimwits! I'll boil you if you spill any more wash water! Wheat!" All the orphans, boys and girls, wore the same haircuts, making it nearly impossible to tell one from another. Their clothes were an identical gray, which grew increasingly threadbare during the washings as they were passed down from one child to another. Skinny, sad-eyed, covered with sores from the lack of proper foods, not one orphan smiled or laughed or told jokes or chased another in games of tag. Games were forbidden, and play had been outlawed. No one belonged to any other. Brothers and sisters were separated. There were no holidays and never any birthday cakes. Lanterns cast a dim light in the dark courtyard. Big Operator and the king could see another work detail carrying brooms, preparing to march out to sweep the streets. The workers were all barefoot, and the night was cold. "Hey-ya!" shouted their assistant keeper, and bleated on her whistle. "Wheat! Wheat! Wheat!" As one, the troop centered the broom handles on their shoulders. "I told you to keep in line!" shouted the guard again, and she stomped on the foot of a little child who had stumbled. "Gotcher!" shouted the keeper cruelly as the child dropped the broom and grasped her poor foot, but uttered not a sound. The penalty for sobbing was a hot poker prod. Big Operator seethed with enormous rage. It was against this abuse that he had given his life, against this outrage that he had masterminded the resistance, against these indignities that he had worked for the restoration. He wanted to yell and shout. He wanted to take that guard and shake her by her shoulders. The king restrained him with his hand. Then a voice demanded, "What you doin' here? No outsiders allowed on the premises." It was an older child dressed in faded blue, an orphan who had come up through orphan ranks and was now dressed in the uniform of an assistant in training. He was still barefoot. Only full-fledged assistants were issued footwear. Their food rations were also increased from 1 meal a day to 2, and they were given whistles. For some, that was reason enough to mistreat one's fellow orphan. "Hello, Jason," said the king. "We've come to speak to the orphan keeper." At the sound of his name, the boy's eyes widened. Orphans were addressed only by number and rank. The last person who had spoken his name had been his mother, years ago. So long ago he could scarcely remember her face or the sound of her voice. The boy cocked his head as though listening to something far away, something almost forgotten. He moved closer. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice very low. The king answered in the same way, gently, careful not to frighten the orphan. "I am the king." How did you know my name?" "I know all the names of the ones who belong to me." At that moment a siren horn blared, whistles blew, "Wheat! Wheat!" and all the orphans closed ranks, hup two, hup two, hup two, and stood at attention. The assistant orphan keepers saluted in front of their squads. All was quiet in the courtyard, except for the sound of orphans snuffling runny noses and the stamp, stamp, stamp of frozen feet on the cold, hard stones, and the wailing of the night wind out of Enchanted City. "She comes," whispered the child. "She comes each night for inspection." The expression in his eyes looked as though a brief glimpse into a world once loved and longed for had been shattered. In terror, the child ran to find his place. Suddenly, a woman appeared at the inside entrance to the orphan's pavilion. She was tall and beautiful and wore glamorous clothes, purple fitted pants with matching purple boots, and a flowing red robe which she swept from one side to another behind her. She cracked a cat-o'-nine-tails whip in her hand. A golden headdress embossed with flames crowned her brilliant black hair. She wore bracelets and rings and ear loops and one glittering necklace draped over another and another. Drummers rolled the announcement of her appearing. Trrrr-ta-ta! Beside her stood 2 burners with glowing pokers. Keeper assistants bowed in the ranks, their whistles clattering on the paving stones. Torch-bearers lit her path. With each step, the orphan keeper's jewels glimmered and glistened in the reflected torchlight. Her severe beauty was chiseled by the hard edge of hatred. Her eyes flashed with malignant power over the orphans who had been entrusted to her keeping. There was nothing soft in all her body or in all her soul. "I am Orphan Keeper," she intoned. "You will do my bidding. You will keep my commands. I have control over your lives and your destinies. I am the one who says yea and nay. You can never escape. You can never go where I say no." The children cowered, even the older ones. All knew this loveless woman had power to send them to the underworld, to poison their food and to call it night ailment, to advance them or to cut off their rations. It was she who ordered punishment for all if one orphan misbehaved. "You are mine! You are mine!" she shouted again, lashing the air with the hand whip. "Let my children go!" Everyone within the courtyard froze. The drums stopped in mid-roll. Trrr-ta! Who dared disrupt the orphan keeper's time schedule? Who dared interrupt her early night work duty harangue? The children shivered in the cold, miserable with hunger and now with dread. What torture would they suffer because of this unspeakable challenge? The king had shouted the words. He faced the orphan keeper, throwing the hood of his common garment back from his head as though she would recognize him once his face was fully revealed in the torchlight. The children gasped at such defiance. Who was this man? The king's hair glimmered with gold highlights, and his loosened street robe fell to the paving stones, and he stood strong and tall and broad-shouldered and handsome. Big Operator gasped. He had never beheld his king undisguised, so young and so beautiful. The orphan keeper cracked her cat-o'-nine-tails whip in the air. "I know you, you troublemaker, you instigator. Who do you think you are, challenging my power? The enchanter has cast his spell over these children. They are mine. I can do what I please with them." The king answered her not a word, but all could see he was as angry as she. He crossed the pavement and lifted his hands. A wind began to blow around and around. Whoo! Whoo! It caught the torches of the torch-bearers and bound the flames in one windy firebrand. Whoo! Up it shot into the night sky over the orphan pavilion, blazing. By its light, all could see the king grab the hand whip from the orphan keeper's grasp, lash the pokers from the burner's hands, scatter the assistants with a crack, and then toss the instruments of torture into the sky. A bolt of lightning flashed from nowhere, striking with a crack. Flames burst and a ball of fire fell to the ground, finally to be extinguished at the orphan keeper's feet. The ranks of orphans gasped. The assistant keepers hid their prodding spoons, sticks, and shovels behind their backs, dropped them to the ground, or pushed them under carts. Then, in the unlit dark, all could see the warm radiance of the man standing in the middle of the courtyard, daring to defy the evil power of the orphan keeper herself. The king signaled to Big Operator, and together, with a mighty thrust, they overturned the boiling vat of palace laundry. They ripped the wheels from the work carts, their muscles straining in a fury of indignation. And no one moved to stop them. The burners stood mesmerized. No warning signal was given to the Dagoda. The orphan keeper hissed as though air was escaping from her lungs. Many of the children dropped to their knees, clasping their hands together beneath their chins, scarcely daring to hope. Was this one who could save them? Would their misery finally end? Was freedom close? The king straightened himself again and stared the orphan keeper in the eyes. "You mistake yourself, madam," he said. His voice was tight with controlled wrath. "These children are not yours. They belong to me." With those words, he motioned to Big Operator, who stepped forward, wiping axle grease from his hands on his overalls. He bent his knee and bowed. Though comrade to the king before, he was an obedient subject now. "Is the taxi vanguard ready?" asked the king. "Yes, my lord, ready and waiting." His voice was full of satisfaction. At that, the orphan keeper screamed, staggering to her feet. "Sss! You can't take these children. They're waifs. They're Kabyles, slaves. The wolves will tear them to shreds. They do my bidding. They won't come with you." Shh. Paying no attention, the king lifted his crossed arms and spread them in a circle above his head. More light diffused from his stretching embrace till it filled every corner of the grim courtyard. The orphans' frozen feet began to warm, their cold, wet garments began to dry, their wounds and sores began to heal in the gentle light, their hearts began to mend. "What you don't understand, madam," said the king, "is that every orphan answers when his name is called in love." Then the king began to call their names. Names unspoken for months, for years, names they themselves had almost forgotten. He called them in family groups, brothers and sisters, brothers and brothers, sisters and sisters, according to age and position. He spoke their names with tenderness, with kindly affection, with cherished intimacy, as though he had been practicing them for years. Kristen, Ned, James, Sarah, and Susan. Anne, Ted, John, and Linda. Jason and Maria. Alex, Sharon, and Rob. Eric, Jane, and Kathy. Diane. And each child remembered his or her name, and each child stepped from their ranks. He was more than a number, more than flesh for the meat grinder of the enchanter's labor machines. He had a name chosen in love, and a family history, and a king who was worthy of service. Big Operator stood now at the street entrance to the pavilion. The beastly wolves lay silent in a stupor of sleep. He put 2 fingers to his mouth and blew a cabby signal. At this, his master's strategy went into operation. The first taxi accelerated to curbside. The first ready orphan group climbed into the back and front seats. The driver honked and then hurried off toward the garbage dump as another cab pulled up to take another load, followed by another and another. And inside, the king continued to speak the children's names. And with each naming, the orphan keeper grew grayer, more haggard, leaking hot air. Her hair lost its luster, her teeth grew black, and her hair straggly, until all could see her for her true self. A wicked hag who had gorged on the energy and youth and beauty of the children given to her keeping. A faker whose evil power was not her own. A no-people in disguise, as all were who gave themselves to do the will of the enchanter. Finally, she was nothing but a pile of dust covered by filthy red and purple rags. Her gold melted and her jewels turned to powder. And Big Operator was glad. His heart leaped with gladness. He knew the enchanter would take revenge. But if this be his last strategic rescue design ever, he had been at the side of the king as together they emptied the pavilion of every last orphan. He closed his eyes and listened to the taxi vanguard, his taxi vanguard, honking throughout all of Enchanted City. Hark, hark! Here, there, and everywhere. Hark, hark! It sounded in his ears like a raucous chorus of jubilant rescue. The king stood beside him ready to leave and to accompany the escapees to Great Park. The hand clasp between them was firm and long. Their anger was gone, but, strangely, there was no exultation, just a quiet sadness. Both knew what dire consequences their defiant acts would set into motion. "Farewell," said the king, and they embraced, the embrace of two mighty men. The orphan exodus was accomplished. Big Operator watched the king disappear into the night, and though he knew it was just his imagination, it seemed as though a crowd of children stood all over the city, clapping their hands and shouting, "Bravo!" And when the last taxi had hurried away with the last load, on a whim, Big Operator bowed to the city, and the applause rose louder in his heart. For Big Operator had learned through the years of masterminding the taxi resistance that mighty deeds demand mighty risks, but that it is worth risking all for the sake of the kingdom and the king.